Welcome everyone to the Wilmette Institute's webinar series, which has as its purpose to highlight the immense diversity of the Baha'i teachings and the ways that they contribute to the contemporary world, and particularly how they contribute to the prevailing discourses of society. Today, we're going to look at the history of the Baha'i Faith in Russia, a history which is long and distinguished, longer than the history of the Baha'i Faith in the United States, in fact. We will also look a little bit about the contemporary situation with the Russian Baha'i community. And I should add that we will not be discussing the current conflict in this particular webinar, just to make sure we all understand that particular point. But let me move on now and say a little something about our upcoming webinars, just so that you're aware of them. We have several things coming up, webinars and courses in August. We actually have a very busy August that you should know about. We will have another webinar in the Religion and Science in the Globalized World series coming up on August 13th, which is basically 2 weeks from today. And then on August 26th, we have a trifecta of 3 different presentations planned by the Baha'i Publishing Trust, all based on books that the Publishing Trust has recently produced. A Child in the Holy Land with Gisu Mahajir, a book that she has produced. Servant to the Servants with Joel Neisen and Kathy and Gary Hoganson. And then finally, Point of Adoration by Michael Day. And those particular dates you can see on the screen. We also have coming up in August 3 courses: Science, Religion, and the Baha'i Faith on August 16th, 7 Valleys and 4 Valleys through Creative Arts Expression, which is really a lot of fun if you're interested in the arts, on the 23rd, and then finally Operationalizing Moral Excellence in Business on August 30th. This particular slide really gives you a good idea of the range of things the Wilmette Institute does: history, biography, science, religion, art, business. We really have quite a variety of ways of looking at this particular religious tradition. But let me now move on and introduce our speaker for the day, Dr. Mikhail Sergeyev, a dear friend of mine of closing in on 30 years, it seems to me. He has a PhD in religious studies from Temple University in religion and philosophy, and he's also very interested in modern art, and he's a modern art historian. He served as the editor of a book series on contemporary Russian philosophy published by Brill Publishers, and he's been the chair of the Wilmette Institute's Department of Religion, Philosophy, and Theology for some years now and helps to coordinate that department. He has organized many webinars for us on philosophical topics and now history as well. It shows you the breadth of his interests. He teaches currently at the University of the Arts in Philadelphia, and he's also been teaching Baha'i courses through the Graduate Theological Union of Berkeley, California, on behalf of the Wilmette Institute, which is an affiliate there. So quite a few different things. He's published more than 200 scholarly, literary, and journalistic articles in a variety of countries, and he writes in both English and Russian, which is his native language. So the man of immense talent, a breadth of interests, and a delightful person to know as well. And so with that, probably longer introduction than you had wanted, Mikhail, I will turn this program over to you and welcome you once again to the Wilmette Institute's webinar series.
Thank you, Robert. That was too long. That's for sure.
Well, I like to talk about you sometimes.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, all the viewers that joined this webinar. Let me begin by saying a couple of comments. Robert was absolutely right when he said that we are not going to touch on the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. I will be presenting the history of the Baha'i Faith in Russia, but while presenting the history, I will talk a little bit about current developments and those current developments are unavoidably linked with the present situation Russia finds herself in. The second comment is about the viewers. I see that the viewers are coming, and if you are watching us via Zoom, you could always write down your questions in the Q&A chat. So please do that. We will reserve your questions for a Q&A session at the end of my presentation. Those of you who are watching us via YouTube, please do not forget to like our presentation and to subscribe to the Wilmette Institute YouTube channel if you have not done so yet, because the more likes we have, the more reactions we have, the more comments we have, the more questions we have, the more people will watch this video, because that is how the YouTube algorithm is working. So if you do not have any questions, still write something down on YouTube as well. If you are watching us already after the live stream, also please don't be lazy, do not procrastinate. Write something down on the below the video. Write a comment, write about where you are watching us from, or say something friendly. So that's what I always tell before I begin my presentation. Now, my presentation is about Baha'i faith in Russia. It's about Baha'i history and current developments. And let me first say a couple of words about how I came up with this topic. The thing is that although I come from Russia, from the Soviet Union, I emigrated to the United States more than 30 years ago, before the collapse of the Soviet Union. I never heard about the Baha'i faith in the Soviet Union. So the first Baha'is I met in the United States. And for the last quarter of a century, I knew little about the Baha'i faith in Russia. But because of the current situation in Russia, because of the war between Russia and Ukraine, I got involved again with my Russian friends. I started watching YouTube Russian channels. I kind of rediscovered my Russian cultural roots. And I also made friends with many Russian Baha'is. I did some research. I did several interviews with those Baha'is whom I consider to be prominent Baha'i scholars nowadays working in Russia. And as a result, I came up with this presentation, which I hope is the beginning of my research into writing a series of essays and finally, hopefully, a book, not only about Baha'i faith in Russia, but Baha'i faith and Russia. Because one thing is to trace the development of Baha'i faith in Russia. Another thing is to find some parallels, sometimes amazing parallels, between the Russian cultural tradition in the 19th century and in the 20th century and Baha'i teachings. If the first part of my presentation may be more or less known to my viewers, well, at least in a very short form, the second part, and you will see only glimpses of the second part in this presentation. The second part is completely unknown to the West and to the Russians, by the way, because there are many exciting similarities and parallels between the so-called Silver Age of Russian culture of the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, and the development of the Baha'i faith. Let me just say that Bahá'u'lláh experienced his revelation when he saw the vision of a woman, the handmaiden, and Russian religious philosopher who was a contemporary of Bahá'u'lláh in Russia, also saw three visions of the woman whom he called the eternal feminine. His first vision was in Egypt, where he flew because he was inspired and attracted to something that he thought will happen there. And we are talking about the years, the last quarter of the 19th century. Just one amazing mystical parallel. And there are so many parallels like that, because Solovyov's vision of the eternal feminine, or Sophia, the wisdom of God, became a very important current, not only in Russian philosophical studies, not only in Russian religious studies, but also in Russian poetry. There was the whole school of Russian symbolists who were talking about this mystical union with the wisdom of God. And this tradition was never compared with the Baha'i Faith, which was in the nascent state back then. So let me begin my presentation by telling you a little bit about my sources, my current sources. The first one is, of course, Yuli Ioannessian, whom I came to know for the first time here in the United States. He lived in the United States for some years and taught here, by the way. I believe he is the most prominent Russian Baha'i scholar living now in Russia. He is the author of several books, including Introduction to the Baha'i Faith and translations of Baha'i texts. He is a scholar of Iranian Orientalism, a candidate of philosophical sciences, and he basically dedicated his life to exploring the role Russia played in the history of the Baha'i Faith, back from its earliest stage. So he is an invaluable source when it comes to Russian scholars of the 19th century and the early 20th century who did a lot of translations of Baha'i texts. So I will be talking a lot about those scholars, and my information about the scholars comes from Yuli Ioannessian and the interview with Yuli. Okay, let me see. So here comes another great source, Olga Merti. Olga Merti is not a scholar. She is a journalist and a writer, but she is a great source about my knowledge of the Ashgabat community. Now, the name of the city, Ashgabat in Russian, in English is translated or transliterated in different ways. Sometimes Ishkabad, sometimes Ishkabad with two words, with one word. Ashgabat, Ashgabat, it's the same thing. And as Olga Merti told me, Ashgabat means the city of love. So Olga was born a year after the great Ashgabat earthquake of 1948. The city was rapidly recovering and growing up, and I'm quoting from my interview with her. And she was very interested in the history of her city. She was interested of the Baha'i community that was there, of the temple. And it turns out she actually saw the walls of the world's first temple. They remained intact after the earthquake. And it turned out that her grandfather had actually built this temple. He had come from Yazd in Iran, along with other Baha'is who had been encouraged to go there and to start a community. Let me turn the slide. So she says, in this way, the history of Baha'i faith was gradually revealed to her and to other young people. And it was the history that was very closely related to the history of the city where she was born. She started collecting photographs. She was talking to relatives and members of that historical Baha'i community of Ashgabat. And she became the main researcher, now living in Russia, the main researcher that wrote about this community and that possesses, I think, the best knowledge, the most accurate knowledge about what was going on there. So in my brief presentation of the community of Ashgabat, I will be relying on the interview with Olga. And finally, the third major source of my presentation, whom I'd like to mention, is Elena Mitnik. Elena Mitnik served as an editor-publisher at the Baha'i Unification or Unity Publishing House for 20 years, from 1993 to 2013. Now she is an independent researcher. But in the spirit of service, Elena has been exploring the life and literary works of Isabella Grinevskaya, another interesting figure in the history of the Baha'i faith in Russia. She was a famous translator, critic, poet, writer, playwright of the late 19th century and the first quarter of the 20th century. Now, the thing is that Isabella Grinevskaya has a double namesake, Isabella Grinevskaya. But the second Isabella Grinevskaya was a Jewish writer who wrote in Yiddish and Russian. Later, I think she immigrated somewhere, but if you open the Russian Wikipedia, our Baha'i Isabella Grinevskaya and that second Isabella Grinevskaya are merged into one person. And that confusion was clarified by Elena Mitnik, it seems to me for the first time, because she worked with the sources, with the original sources. She published some of Grinevskaya's, our Baha'i Grinevskaya's most significant works. She's her book, Travel to the Land of the Sun. It is being published now, piece by piece. So she was working with the archives, and her task is to reconstruct and restore the real life and work of Isabella Grinevskaya, who is completely forgotten in the mainstream Russian culture. So the most interesting thing about Grinevskaya is that she wrote two dramatic poems, The Bab in 1903 and Bahá'u'lláh. In Russian, it was spelled Bahá'u'lláh, which were devoted to the key moments in the history of the Baha'i faith. To achieve greater theatricality, she slightly altered the events, but when she made pilgrimage to Akka and saw and talked to Abdul Baha approved of both poems, and Grinevskaya became the first and the only person who wrote dramatic poems about the founders, the twin prophets of the Baha'i faith, approved by Abdul Baha, because generally speaking, Baha'is should not make the founders of the faith and their families the characters in their literary works. So therefore, Grinevskaya is unique in this respect. So now let me move on to the Russian history. And here we have an interesting confusion again. All Baha'is know that Baha'u'lláh, after after announcing his revelation around 1963, wrote a series of letters, or I may be wrong, now it escapes me when exactly Baha'u'lláh addressed the leaders of the world, either before or after. I think after, but it doesn't really matter for my presentation. So let me say this. Everybody knows that Baha'u'lláh at some point addressed the leaders of the world. And those letters or epistles are collected as the summons of the Lords of Hosts. One of those letters was addressed to the Russian Tsar. And the letter was especially important because the Russian Tsar was the only political leader at that time. We are talking about 1852, early 1850s, who actually helped Baha'u'lláh when he was imprisoned and offered him an exile in Russia. And in his letter, Baha'u'lláh thanks the Tsar and actually mentions that he was the only one. So where is the confusion? The confusion is that if you look at those letters, you will see that the title of the letter says that the letter is addressed to the Tsar Alexander II. Now, when the letter was written, the Russian Tsar was Alexander II. However, the Russian Tsar who actually offered Baha'u'lláh the exile in Russia was his father, Tsar Nicholas I. The thing is that Tsar Nicholas I died in 1855. He was the Russian emperor between 1825 until 1855. And the Russian Tsar Nicholas I is known in the history of Russia as a reactionary Tsar. His reign started with the failed Decembrist revolt of 1825, when the nobility wanted a constitution and some kind of reforms and liberalization, but he crushed this revolt. And he's mainly remembered in history as a reactionary whose controversial reign was marked by geographical expansion, centralization of administrative policies, and repression of dissent. Now, his biographer, it is 20th century Russian scholar Nicholas Ryazanovsky, the Tsar's biographer said that in his public persona, I quote, Nicholas I came to represent autocracy personified, infinitely majestic, determined and powerful, hard as stone and relentless as fate. So it is this Tsar that actually tried to help Baha'u'lláh in spite of him being a reactionary. And it is this Tsar that was ready to accept Baha'u'lláh and his relatives in Russia. Now, the question is whether Baha'u'lláh was addressing his letter to remembering this Tsar, or he was addressing this letter to his son. Now, his son, Tsar Alexander II, became the emperor of Russia in 1855 when his father died. And his father started the Crimean War that lasted for 3 years, from 1853 to 1856. The outcome of this war was unfavorable to Russia. And Alexander II, unlike his father, initiated a program of domestic reforms. So he is known in the history of Russia as a reformer. In 1861, he emancipated the serfs. That was something historical, equal in importance to the emancipation of slaves in the United States. For this act, he was called the Tsar Liberator. In 1864, he initiated a judicial reform, introduced elective local self-governing assemblies known as zemstvas. A series of military reforms included the Army Statute of 1874, which for the first time in Russia established conscription, making military service legally binding for young men of all classes. So the question is, to which Tsar Baha'u'lláh actually addressed his letter? So I believe that Baha'u'lláh addressed his letter to the institution of Tsardom. He was not interested in a particular person. He was thankful that one of the Russian Tsars actually tried to help him. But he was more interested in his personal message to the Tsar. And as we know, that message was not so much favorable. So in 1852, at the height of the persecution of the Babis, when Baha'u'lláh, then imprisoned, I quote often from my interviews, was facing reprisals and the death penalty, a representative of the Russian diplomatic mission in Tehran extended his helping hand. In the epistle to the Russian Tsar, which was written, I assume, much later, the founder of the new religion wrote about this episode. Whilst I lay chained and fettered in the prison, one of thy ministers extended me his aid. Wherefore hath God ordained for thee a station which the knowledge of none can comprehend, except his knowledge. Beware lest thou barter away this sublime station. Okay, so I'm looking at the questions. I see that the questions are coming. So let me say it again. Please, if you watch us live, you can ask the questions in the Q&A chat if you watch us on Zoom. And you can ask questions on YouTube, also in YouTube chat. If you don't want to ask anything, please write something, write where you are watching us from, write what you think about the topic, write what you think about what is happening in Russia, write, anything pertaining to the topic of my talk, because the more comments we do have, the better the YouTube will make afterwards. So now let me continue. Here is another quotation from Baha'u'lláh, and that comes from the summons of the Lord of Hosts. Epistle to the Russian Tsar continued. Beware lest thy sovereignty withhold thee from him who is the supreme sovereign. Arise thou amongst men in the name of this all-compelling cause, and summon then the nations unto God, the exalted, the great. Couldst thou but know the things sent down by my pen, and discover the treasures of my cause, and the pearls of my mysteries, which lie hid in the seas of my names, and in the goblets of my words, thou wouldst, in thy love for my name, and in thy longing for my glorious and sublime kingdom, lay down thy life in my path. Now, just to finish with the Tsar Alexander II, to whom, as it is traditionally perceived, Baha'u'lláh wrote this letter. Alexander II did modernize Russia. He released political prisoners, accepted Western-style culture and technology, but he stopped short of establishing the parliament as the people's representative and decision-making institution. Unfortunately, there was a failed assassination attempt on him in 1866, and as a result of that, he turned to conservatism and repressive policies following his father. His reactionary politics brought the resurgence of revolutionary movement and revolutionary terrorism. And on March the 1st of 1881, when the Tsar finally decided to convene a parliament and ratify the first Russian constitution, Precisely on that day, he was assassinated by the members of the revolutionary terrorist organization People's Will. So the next Tsar, who was his son, obviously, but who is also associated with the development of the Baha'i faith in Russia, was Tsar Alexander III. Alexander Romanov was the emperor of Russia from 1881 until he died in 1894. The rule of Alexander III was reactionary, obviously, after the assassination of his father. He established the policy known as counter-reforms and reversed many liberal initiatives of his father, Alexander II. Under the influence of a Russian statesman and advisor to the Tsar, Konstantin Pobedonoscev, Alexander III was against any political or social changes that challenged his authoritarian power. On the bright side, Russia fought no significant wars during his tenure, so Alexander III is known as the peacemaker. During the reign of this Tsar, Baha'is in Ashgabat, which was then part of the Russian Empire, enjoyed equal protection under the law, along with other inhabitants of that state. And that was evidenced by the construction of the first Baha'i temple in Ashgabat, and by impartial investigation of the murder of one Baha'i by the Shia fanatics, resulting in the severe sentencing of the murderers. It's also happened that during the reign of Alexander III, another quotation from my interview with Yulia Ioannisyan, for the first time in Baha'i history, a fair trial organized by the Russian authorities over the murderers of a Baha'i martyr in Ashgabat confirmed the independent character of the Baha'i religion from Islam at the legal level. Now, why do we say that and how do we know that? Because when you testify on the trial, you put your hand on the scriptures. And Baha'is were not putting their hand on the Bible or on the Quran. They put their hand on Baha'i texts. That was allowed by the judge, and the judge, by doing that, basically confirmed that Baha'i faith is an independent religion for the first time in its history. During the trial that took place in 1889, the Russian authorities, for the first time again in Baha'i history, in Russia or elsewhere, did not regard the new religion as an Islamic heresy or some kind of reformist movement. As I said, this was evidenced by, I quote, the fact that unlike Muslims, Sunnis, and Shiites swore on oath on the Quran for all in court without exception, for Baha'is who participated in the trial as witnesses, the Quran oath was replaced by another procedure. Now, the murderers had been sentenced to death, but at the request of the Baha'is themselves, the sentence was commuted to community service, as was also reported in the Russian press. And here is how Baha'u'lláh responded to that act. He wrote a letter to Tsar Alexander III. As far as I know, this letter is not translated into English. I may not be aware of the translation, but I have never seen it. It was translated by Alexander Tumansky at the turn of the century, in the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, from Arabic into Russian. And here is the translation by Yulia Ioannisyan from Russian into English. So therefore, this is a provisional translation, but here is a quotation from that epistle, Baha'u'llah's epistle to the community of Ashgabat. Truly the shining power, may God strengthen it, has shown justice. This help of the power of light, that's how Baha'u'llah called Russia, by the way. Such a good title. This help of the power of light, this demonstration of truth and justice, God willing, will erase the tyranny and violence of the world. To this community, we bequeath that it will not forget this justice, and that from the depth of its heart, it will pray to God that he may continue and prolong with the longevity and power and kingship the exploits of him who holds the banner of justice, for God alone designed to help those oppressed by all and decreed a just verdict. And this is the first aid which has been given to these oppressed, thanks to the will of the greatest emperor and the most honorable general. May Almighty God strengthen them both. Now, usually when people talk about Russia and the Baha'i Faith, they are reminded of Leo Tolstoy. There is a short book that actually tells us the story of Leo Tolstoy and his encounter with the Baha'i Faith. Now, this is part of that second stream of my research, which is not about the Baha'i Faith in Russia, but the Baha'i Faith and Russia and Russian culture, because Leo Tolstoy never became a Baha'i. Leo Tolstoy was well aware of the Baha'i Faith, of the spread of the Baha'i Faith. He was exchanging letters with Abdul Baha. He met Baha'i representatives. He wanted to write a book about the Baha'i Faith. But Leo Tolstoy was a typically Enlightenment type thinker, who went through a very long and complex religious evolution. He started as a secular writer who wrote his famous novels, War and Peace and Anna Karenina. But in the 1870s, he underwent a profound spiritual crisis, which he described in his A Confession. And as a result of that, he started his spiritual search, which first led him to become the Orthodox Christian. Then he studied Greek and Hebrew and made his own translation of the four Gospels from the original Koine Greek. After making this translation, he realized that the Orthodox Christian teaching is not fully compatible with what Christ actually taught. And he rebelled against the Orthodox Christian Church. In the early 20th century, he was excommunicated from the Orthodox Christian Church. Tolstoy studied all world religions. He practiced interreligious dialogue in those days, end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. He made a collection of greatest sayings from world religious leaders and the world's greatest thinkers like Lao Tzu and Confucius, etc. So he was a very progressive guy. If we are talking about that time. He even created his own religious sect, which is known as the group of people who stand for the nonviolent resistance against evil. Tolstoy thought that this sentence, nonviolent resistance to evil, covers the essence of what Christ actually taught. And he articulated his creed in such books as The Kingdom of God is Within You, the book that had a deep impact on Mahatma Gandhi in India with Gandhi's peaceful transition to India's independence, and on Martin Luther King Jr., among others, on his nonviolent resistance to slavery and to the vestiges of slavery. So as for Leo Tolstoy and the Baha'i Faith, he first heard about the Babis in 1884. His attitude to the faith was ambiguous. And I'm quoting from various sources, articles, and books. It was ambiguous because Tolstoy did not have access to the fullness of information about the Baha'i teachings. And his lack of knowledge as well as the inconsistency of his own philosophical views, sometimes led thinker to reject the faith. That is a question from the article by Ackerman, Nancy Ackerman, and Graham Hussell. Now, I would disagree. His philosophical views were not inconsistent. They were quite consistent. And he was an Enlightenment type thinker who believed that all people are equal. And if Christ had not realized the ultimate truth of human existence, nonviolent resistance to evil, then he, Leo Tolstoy, would have realized it by himself. In other words, Tolstoy rejected the idea of the manifestation of God or the prophecy in Judaism or the incarnation in Christianity. He rejected the idea of those special people who are intermediaries between God and the rest of humanity. Since he rejected that, he would have accepted the teaching by Baha'is, but he would not have accepted the overall structure of leadership. That's my view. Abdu'l-Baha knew that Tolstoy was interested in the faith. He advised Baha'is to contact him. In 1902, Tolstoy received a personal message from Abdu'l-Baha. You could read the quotation later on. In 1902, when asked about his attitude toward Baha'u'lláh and his cause, Tolstoy replied, "How can I deny it?" And yes, Tolstoy was a universalist, a pacifist, who would readily accept the idea of global peace and security. So that's why he said that it is obvious that this cause will win over the whole world. Tolstoy noted that the principles of Baha'i doctrine promoted the spirit of the age and would in time establish themselves in the world, ensuring humanity's prosperity. And about Bahá'í Faith in 1910, shortly before his death, Tolstoy wrote, very profound, I know of no other faith that is so deep. So on this good and optimistic note, let me move from Tolstoy to Russian scholars. I see that our time is moving fast, so I will try to speed up my presentation. Among Russian scholars, I will mention only three persons. The first one is Baron Victor Rosen. He's the most important guy. He's of equal importance to Edward Browne, the famous English Orientalist, who is known for having met Baha'u'lláh. Victor Rosen was the academician of St. Petersburg Academy of Sciences, professor and dean of the Faculty of Oriental Languages. He left behind detailed descriptions of many Babis and Baha'i manuscripts, which are now preserved, not all of them translated yet, in the Institute of Eastern Manuscripts of the Russian Academy of Science. And these descriptions are illustrated with lengthy excerpts from the texts. Now, what is the main difference between Victor Rosen and Edward Browne is that Edward Browne was more focused on histories, the history of the movement, personal interviews, while Victor Rosen was more focused on compiling the actual texts. So that's why many of those texts are now preserved in St. Petersburg's archives. Now, even more, he translated into Russian and published some of the Baha'i scriptures, including Glad Tidings. He also prepared for publication the collection of messages of the founder of the Baha'i religion, consisting of original texts in Arabic and Persian. The second one is Alexander Tumansky, who is his pupil, his student. He was born in 1861. Unfortunately, I could not find his picture. So therefore, I put the cover the cover page of Kitab-i Aqdas, of the Most Holy Book, which Tumansky translated. What was the year? I don't see it, but this is his main accomplishment, the first translation into European language. I'm trying to see the year, 1894. So in 1894, he produced the first translation into European Russian language of the Most Holy Book, subsequently published with the original commentaries and an appendix of other texts. This is really a very interesting book that is available nowadays for free on the internet in Russian language. But Tumansky also published the Will and Testament of Bahá'u'lláh in the original and in translation, as well as several other texts. We do not know whether Tumansky was a Baha'i or not. There are some legendary stories that he declared himself a Baha'i during one of his trips. But as far as I know, it is not confirmed with any written material. And the third scholar I would like to mention was Ignatiy Krachkovsky. He was a Russian and Soviet Arabist, academician. This guy wrote an obituary to the death of Abdul-Baha, whom this scholar knew personally. The obituary published in 1923 said in part, I quote, Abdul-Baha settled in Haifa at the foot of Mount Carmel and enjoyed great influence among representatives of all nations and religions, as well as all classes of people, through the charm of his distinguished personality. In his whole figure and address, there was an inner majesty and great spiritual power, which had a charming effect on everyone, even those who met him by chance, end quote. As far as I know, Krachkovsky was not a Baha'i. So this is a testimony of a person who actually knew Abdul-Baha and who wrote such an obituary. Now let me turn to Isabella Grinevskaya. Isabella Grinevskaya was born in 1864, died in 1944. She was a Baha'i. She was a Baha'i even during the Soviet times, during the so-called silent years or dark years. Her address and phone number were mentioned in the Baha'i sources of that time. But obviously, she did not advertise her Baha'i identity. In fact, she was trying to hide much of her biography. And this is one of the sources of the confusion between her and her double namesake, another Isabella Grinevskaya, which lived around the same time, who was also a writer. Now we know that our Isabella Grinevskaya was born in Poland, which was then part of the Russian Empire. She studied at the Mariinsky Gymnasium in Grodno, and then at the Natural Department of the Pedagogical Courses of St. Petersburg, of the St. Petersburg Female Gymnasiums. She graduated in 1877. Now, in my presentation of Grinevskaya, I use the research of Helena Mitnik as the main source, and the only source, I should say. Now, Grinevskaya's publications appeared on the pages of many journals in Russia: Theater and Art, World Illustration, Новое Время, which means New Time, Pictorial Review, Herald of Europe, etc., etc. But her most significant works are the dramatic poem Bab, which she wrote in 1903. The second edition was published in 1916. And the poem tragedy Bahá'u'lláh, the Glory of God. It was written in 1912, which are dedicated to the key moments in Baha'i history. So Isabella Grinevskaya wrote about her second religious philosophical poem. I quote, in my tragedy Bahá'u'lláh, I depict the life of the Babi community from the time of their flight from Persia until the year of the demise of Bahá'u'lláh. The action itself begins a week or more before his expulsion from Baghdad to Constantinople, although the speeches of the characters from the first act also indicate the preceding events, the very emergence of Babism, the death of the Bab, and the persecution of the Babis in Persia itself. Babis should be with the capital B, not babies, Babis. In parallel, the external and internal tragedies of the life of Baha'u'lláh are portrayed. Now, the poem is available, actually both poems are available for free on the internet in Russian language. They have not been translated into the English language, but, I decided to translate just one, I don't know how to say it, one very small portion of the poem, the end of the poem, when Baha'u'lláh is speaking, addressing to his followers. I was trying to translate it in such a way as to render the original Russian meter. So Baha'u'lláh proclaims to his followers, "But angrily you must not answer, brothers, to scolding and to curses. I swear by the novel day of spring, God wills that among you, O brethren, as in days of peace in motions and in words, let heaven's silence reign, I say. You'll sweep away your troubles, and only in beauty will you charm. Will dissipate in love and beauty's rays all troubles in a moment, like pitiful light ashes." Now, when Isabella Grinevskaya met Abdul-Baha, she made a pilgrimage and was able to meet him. Abdul-Baha, and this quotation comes from Grinevskaya's own book, Journey to the Lands of the Sun, which was not published until recent years and is not published yet completely. The publication is ongoing, but hopefully the whole book will be published soon. So this is the quotation when Abdul-Baha actually responded after listening to her poems. "You are the first woman to pave the way for the knowledge of the Bab and Baha'u'lláh in the poet's portrayal. There have been many women, kings in Europe and Asia, but what is left of them? One Mary Magdalene, who was a simple woman, by her spiritual love of God, is still alive today. What I mean to say is that you have put much labor in not being satisfied with earthly pleasures, that you have ascended to the height of the spiritual world, that you have hovered in the realm of peace for the good of man. And therefore, rest assured that your labors will not go waste. Bahá'u'lláh will be translated into all languages and will be staged on all stages. It will be played even in Persia," he predicted. Now I see that we are moving to the end of my presentation, and I do move to the end of it. I will say a couple of words about the history of the Baha'i community of Ashgabat. Of course, I can say a lot about this because I've read a lot of articles in Russian, a lot of historical evidence. It is a very interesting story, and it is full of horror when it comes to the beginning of the Soviet Union and the beginning of Soviet repressions. There is one book in English that is called The Years of Silence. It is a short book of 90 to 100 pages, which describes in great detail, in horrible detail, the tortures of those Baha'is who were captured by the Soviet communists, imprisoned, then tortured, then exiled. But here is the synopsis, the main outline. In 1882, persecuted believers from Persia found refuge in Turkestan. And as a result, I quote, at the end of the 19th century, the first Baha'i community abroad appeared in the Russian Empire in Ashgabat. Contrary to the traditions and customs of society at the time, the Baha'is of Ashgabat opened 2 schools for boys and girls, regardless of their social and religious backgrounds. A library, reading room, hospital, and dormitory for pilgrims were built next to the Baha'i temple erected in Ashgabat in the early 20th century, providing not only a place to worship, but also opportunities to acquire knowledge and receive assistance and support. I took this text from a brief introduction, the history of faith in Russia, but the introduction is in Russian, so therefore translation is mine. In the 1880s, Baha'i communities emerged not only in Ashgabat, but in Moscow, St. Petersburg, Kazan, Baku, Tashkent, Samarkand, and other cities of the Russian Empire. On the left side, you see the picture of the first spiritual assembly of Moscow. So this is 1880s. But after the change in the political system in the Russian state in 1917, Baha'is were first restricted in their activities. And in the late 1920s, they were either expelled from Russia or sent into exile in Siberia and Kazakhstan. The persecution obviously peaked in 1938. These are the years of Stalin's purges, when all Baha'i communities were virtually destroyed. The few remaining believers, while being faithful to their beliefs, submitted to a government that prohibited religious activities, including Grinevskaya, who was able to survive, but who kept living in isolation. And the resurgence of the Baha'i faith in Russia dates back to the end of 1990s, right before the collapse of the Soviet Union. Here you see the first National Assembly or Spiritual Assembly of Russia. The dark period in the history of the faith in the Russian state lasted until 1990s, when Baha'is once again had the opportunity to share the word of God with their fellow citizens and to revive the administrative institutions of the faith. At this stage, and now let me say that this comes from a brief essay, The History of Faith in Russia. And by saying at this stage, they probably meant before the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. So let's say in the 2000s, there have been about 35 Baha'i communities in the Russian Federation. Russian believers came from various walks of life, had different nationalities and religious backgrounds. And Russian Baha'is, of course, believe that Russia's spiritual and material progress is inevitable, although I personally, would not be that optimistic now. So with this, I will finish my presentation. I'm sorry I went over the time. It's 1 hour and almost 10 years, but I hope we may have 5 or 10 minutes for questions. Hi, Robert. I see you. And
I want to thank you before you take the turn to the questions. And I'm sure we have time for quite a few. I just wanted to make one quick comment that it may
Yes.
very well be that the first person of European background to become a Baha'i may not have been Thornton Chase. It may have been a Russian. We don't know. And
Alexander Tumansky, most
Yeah.
probably Alexander Tumansky, because according to the writings, he was a translator. He went into the Baha'i community, Babi community, Baha'i community. He was among them, and he declared Baha'i back then. It was an oral declaration, but he never advertised this. Yeah.
So I think this is an important thing to point out, and we still don't know the details of when some of these early communities got organized in the Russian Empire, but some of them may very well certainly Ashgabat predates Chicago. But for all we know, there may be communities more in European Russia that predate Chicago and the other early American Baha'i communities. And this is, I think, a fascinating thing that we still need to discover?
Well, look, the first Moscow community was organized in 1880s.
Yeah.
So it is most surely predates American community, which was organized in the beginning of the 20th century, but not so much known about those people. And those Russian researchers are now working in the archives, trying to reconstruct as much as possible the whole history.
Absolutely. It's a very, very important subject. And I'm so delighted that you've been able to present this to us. You know, when the Iron Curtain was falling, the National Spiritual Assembly invited Firuz Kazemzadeh to go to Boston and hold a weekend-long seminar with about 30 people about the history of Russia. And I was privileged to be there and to listen to his several days of lectures about Russian history. And he also talked about the situation with the Ashgabat Baha'is being sent to Siberia, and how his family in Moscow was sending them care packages, and Persian Baha'is even in Moscow were disappearing. And it's really quite chilling and quite amazing. But we should turn to the question and answer now.
Okay, I'm looking at YouTube, and thank you guys for writing something, because it will broaden our audience. I see that people are watching us from Florida, from Ireland, from Canada, North Carolina, New Zealand, North Carolina again. Let me see. I'm trying to get to the questions. Alex Boysen is writing, the subject is one previously known to Baha'is and hence immensely valuable for a better understanding of its historical development. Regarding the proclamation of both its followers and by others, including historians and the growth of the... Okay, so this is a comment, not a question. Let me see. Watching from Las Vegas. Our speaker pointed out that the theme of Grinevskaya's historical works conveyed the tragedy, in Baha'i terms, crisis of the faith history, yes. But she also wrote a book, and that was her final work, the book about her travel to Akka and her meeting with Abdul Baha, and it is a book size and was never translated, was never available. Was still in the archives, and Yelena found it, and now she is publishing it with her notes. Let me see.
Addison has a good comment down there about who in Baha'u'llah's family was married to a Russian.
Yeah, I do not know about that.
I believe it was, as she said, his sister, because as I understand it, his sister, then her husband worked for the Russian legation in Tehran, and that's why Baha'u'llah was able to have a connection with the Russian legation in Tehran.
Okay, thank you, Robert. We have 3 comments, one by Megan Victory. Megan, hi, how are you doing? Is the approved dramatic poem about the Bab and the one about Baha'u'llah available anywhere? Any chance there is an English translation already as well? No, sorry, no English translation. But yes, they are available in Russian, and they are quite long. So I'm not as good in poetry as to translate the whole thing, but look, maybe I should try. After all, at least I tried one portion. It sounded okay to me. What resources, books are available for further research about the Baha'i Faith in Russia? Not many. In fact, most of my sources are in Russian, and actually are personal sources, because I conducted interviews with those 3, well, actually with 4 guys. As for the English sources, there is a book, The Silent Years, that was published by Ronald Publisher in 1999, I believe. It's 90 pages of horrible descriptions of how Baha'is were treated during Stalin's purges. But you know, nothing new for Russians because everybody was treated this way if you were imprisoned and put into the gulag. Carlota Garcia is writing, please provide any sources translated into English. Look, if you, let me share my screen again, and let me come back to the sources. So here you have Alizad, Asadullah, Years of Silence, Baha'is in the USSR, 1938-1946. This source is available. Nancy Ackerman, who was a pioneer in Russia for 10 years, she is now living in Canada. I contacted her again personally and talked to her about her experience in Russia. And Graham Hassel, they wrote an article, The Baha'i Faith in Russia, historical essay, but it is in Russian. It is a preface to the translation of the book, The Baha'i Faith, The Emerging Global Religion, and the article is in Russian. Everything else is only in Russian. So therefore, yeah, I keep thinking about writing an English book about Baha'i Faith and Russia, in which I could summarize all of this.
What other questions do we have? There's another, Addison says here, I don't know if you see it, please write the book. It is very exciting to learn of the trial of the people who murdered the Babis in Ashgabat. First of all, that Babi community was defended, the defense was historic. And second, the trial recognized the Bahá'í Faith as an independent world religion because some witnesses were allowed to swear on Baha'i scripture instead of the Bible or Quran. This is such a pivotal moment in Baha'i history. Thank you for sharing this information. That's very true.
Thank you, Addison. Yeah.
Very true. The descriptions of the Ashgabat community in 1906 by Western Baha'is when they were visiting it really are quite amazing. It was a large community. It had a printing press, and it had all of these dependencies that you've mentioned, and committees of all sorts. And when the repression began in the 1920s, it was really quite difficult to repress the community at that point because it had so many resources, it had so many capable people, so many organizers, and they really had to chip away at them and haul people off to Siberia and force women and children back to Iran and confiscate property and everything. And it was a horrific thing that they did.
So look, I think it's time. It's time to finish.
Yeah, I don't see anything else. Certainly, again, thank you so much, Michal, for this fascinating presentation. I'm delighted that you were able to pull this information together, and we're all looking forward to seeing what else can be said, what else can be written about the community. And there's just so much there that still needs to be found, that it reminds me a bit of American Baha'i history in the 1980s when we were still discovering which communities were founded and when they were founded and all this, and writing it down really for the first time, some of it anyway. Thank you, everyone, for joining the Wilmette Institute today for this webinar. We hope that you take the information home and share it with other people, and please have discourse with people about these topics. Please tell others about our series, and as Michal reminds everybody, like us on YouTube, join our Facebook page so that you can hear about more programs, and then of course tell others that we have 3 more programs coming up actually in August. We hope to see you again very soon. Thank you very much and have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Have a good day.